The profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered even in 100 million kalpas. Having it to hear, accept, and maintain. May I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. This morning, Barry will be speaking. Please.
Thank you, Corin. Good morning, everyone. I, along with you, or many of you, I assume, are hoping for rain, especially those of us in Sonoma County. Can almost feel it coming. This talk kind of went back and forth on what I thought the title should be. So I left it at, is there a dualism in the heart of Buddhism? Not one, not two. So recently I had an interesting spiritual conversation with a wife of a good friend of mine at the end of a nice long walk around Spring Lake. She asked me, isn't it a contradiction? Isn't there a dualistic view of human nature in Buddhism? We all have Buddha nature, she said, but don't we also all suffer from greed, hatred, and delusion as well? Well, which is it? Which is our true nature? First, let's acknowledge that this question comes from a perspective of Buddha nature as good and the three poisons, that is greed, hatred, and delusion, as bad. Now, there is a certain practical use for this perspective, but it is not aligned with the view of reality that Buddhism describes. That said, let's start with trying to define what is Buddha nature. That is a question that you will only really manifest the answer to in your zazen and your life. That said, we have to say something to work out our world together. So here it goes. Buddha nature is emptiness. Here's what Katagiri Roshi says in Returning to Silence. Emptiness, Buddha nature, impermanence exists forever. This means impermanence is immutable. Wherever you may go, only impermanence is immutable. Constant change is completely beyond your speculation. It just is. That is why impermanence is Buddha nature. Dogen, by the way, also described Buddha nature as impermanence. And here's what it says in the Song of Awakening, a verse of the Chinese master Yoka Daishi in the 7th century that Corin was good enough to bring to my attention. Buddha nature, jewel of the precepts, is the foundation of our minds. Drizzles and dew, mists and clouds clothe our bodies. It is always right here, clear and tranquil. If you search for it, you will not see it. You can neither seize nor reject it. Only with an open heart do you realize it. Maybe a useful metaphor is the law of gravity. There is an attractive force between objects in our universe. Whether you believe it, whether you realize it, whether you act out of an understanding of it or not, it just is. The Buddha nature is here, that it pervades everywhere. Understanding this as part of our practice is fundamental. Manifesting this understanding is the other part. And perhaps to get to the heart of my friend's question, it is not just the understanding of impermanence, but the realization or expression of the fundamental reality of it as our being. So now let's turn to the three poisons. In his early teachings, the Buddha identified three poisons or three negative qualities of mind that cause most of our problems and most of the world's problems. The three poisons are greed, also translated sometimes as passion or lust, hatred or anger, and delusion or ignorance. All unwholesome states of mind are variations on these three themes. One metaphor for the three poisons is that they are dark clouds obscuring the sun or the vast sky of our Buddha nature. Their impacts and consequences are quite real, but these transitory mental and emotional states are not the fundamental reality as Buddha nature. To be clear, Buddha nature is not just our nature. It is the nature of all things, everything. But to say that they are impermanent qualities of mind does not mean that they do not have a persistent place in creating suffering in our lives. One has only to trip through the nightly news to see how destructive we can be under the influence of the three poisons. The lie of separation is foundational perspective of each of the three poisons. And by the lie of separation, what I mean is that we see ourselves as subjects, separate from the rest of the world, as if we were on a stage, or as if the world were but a stage and we but actors upon it. This sense of being separate can create a schism between us and the world and lead to a profound alienation or the fruitless attempt to reify our separate selves through pursuing pleasure, power, happiness, money, sex, fame, or simply trying to avoid pain. I believe this sense of separation is deeply embedded in what it is to be human. Our language, our thinking start from a subject and object orientation. There is me at the center, and then objects in the world and other people that I interact with. Humans are also storytellers and understand the world through stories. Stories often have a protagonist, an antagonist, and a narrative. But life has no narrative. That is something that we bring to the party in an effort to understand life and imbue it with a meaning or purpose that we can grasp. We are cognitively wired to have this dualistic perspective in the world. I believe it is also embedded in our biology through a sense of self-preservation, a drive to thrive, to procreate. In short, we are dopamine-seeking animals, and many of us go for the cheap fix. And there is no question that this sense of separation is deeply embedded in our socialization. Society treats us as separate individuals, perhaps necessarily for creating and maintaining social order. And then it conditions us with all kinds of dualistic thinking around right and wrong, success and failure, acceptable and unacceptable, in-group, out-group, and gender and racial identity. So if you see the origins of our delusions and grasping behaviors as embedded in our psychology, biology, and socialization, it starts to look like our nature, doesn't it? There is no question, I think, that the three poisons are very strong tendencies. But I think you will also agree that they are not immutable. We can resist temptation and direct our anger in more productive ways. We can sometimes question our own deluded views. We can find peaceful resolution to conflict and change our stories. And then there are those moments when, for example, we catch the full moon rising in autumn on the horizon, a great luminous gift that takes us out of ourselves. When the personal perspective is lost, so are the three poisons. And I would argue that our Zazen practice increases the frequency and duration of such moments. But I am not sure that it really cures us from the three poisons. Rather, from my experience, it creates the space where I can better understand my anger, greed, and understand where they may pull me off balance and hopefully help me navigate my way back. I remember when I was still in my 20s and I thought, if I could get me some of that enlightenment, all my problems would be solved. I would be confident, kind, never suffer from anxiety again, know how to do the right thing in every situation. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I'm sure that none of you have suffered from those kinds of delusions. But that is not what awakening is like, is it? It is not a noun, but more of a verb. It is not another feather our fragile ego can stick in its cap. It is a realization of the fundamental underlying nature of things, or Buddha nature. And I suspect that, like all realizations, it waxes and wanes in intensity and clarity. It is more of an attunement or an alignment. And things happen in life to us humans. We get tired, stressed, feel overwhelmed, feel lonely. We get caught in a story or a view or an emotion, and we're no longer attuned. Let me tell you a sad story. I studied intensively with Joshu Suzaki Roshi in Southern California for 14 months when I was in my late 20s. The Mount Baldy Zen Center was in an old Boy Scout camp at 6,500 feet in the San Gabriel Mountains. The landscape was stark and beautiful. The winter was incredibly cold and magnificently beautiful. Suzaki was an indomitable fire plug of a man with boundless energy who started studying Rinzai Zen in a Japanese monastery when he was a boy and was ordained as a monk at 13, lived to be 107 years old. I am grateful to his dedication to the Dharma and for what he taught me. Nonetheless, while I was there, he had an inappropriate relationship with a much younger female student. Disappointingly, I heard that the senior students, because this was never openly discussed around me, passed this behavior off as teaching for everyone involved. Let's call that what it is. Groupthink, deluded horseshit. I left the Zen Center shortly afterwards, but that whole situation never sat well with me. About 20 years later, I heard from a friend who was a senior student that Suzaki had inappropriate sexual contact with over 30 female students. The whole Sangha nearly fell apart. Now, I'm not here today to judge Suzaki or discuss the causes for this abuse of power, although I will say that having no peers to rely on, be held accountable to, did not help. But rather, I want to convey the impression it had on me and its relevance to the topic of the three poisons. Here was a man who, in my estimate, and that of many others, had real insight and a great understanding of the Dharma. And yet for decades, he consistently undermined what he had dedicated his whole life to through his own actions. And he caused real harm to those who had placed trust in him. Unless we are tempted to dismiss this as an example of one man's personal failings. I know of at least 3 other Zen teachers of this era, including one from a Soto lineage, all of whom had Dharma transmission and all of whom were involved in similar abusive behavior. Wow. How do we make sense of that? Lust, power, and delusion are a toxic cocktail, and evidently also one that having an awakening experience doesn't protect you from, doesn't exempt you from. So it appears that awakening up from that is not a one-time thing. Perhaps we do not fully move beyond the 3 poisons until we move beyond this body and this mind. I'm not sure. But it seems clear to me that it is not easy to free ourselves from that kind of grasping. But this is not a reason for despair, or if you find it to be, please give that despair some space and place in your life. But for me, I think it is just an invitation, yet another indication of the fundamental nature of the reality that we find ourselves in. Impermanence. Even realization does not protect us from it, and realization is not exempt from it. There is no free pass on the Nirvana Samsara Express, just the next moment to embody, the next choice as we tunnel through the darkness. Perhaps what we need is a reframe. Rather than seeing the 3 poisons as things to overcome, to vanquish, to rid ourselves of, we can start to see them as things we need to understand, as gates to our essential Buddha nature. Dogen said, we should establish our practice in our delusion. The Tibetan Buddhists have a practice of demon feeding that Lama Tsultrim has adapted for Western practitioners. Instead of resisting our demons or letting them run amok, we are invited to make friends with them, to really imagine what they look like, to understand them, their needs, and give them what they want, to feed them, if you will. I have found this to be a very powerful practice, one that allows me to see my negative mental and physical impulses more clearly. This practice can be done alone or with someone guiding you through it. In my experience, doing it with someone else is far more powerful. So often we think we have to figure this out all by ourselves, yet we all struggle with these issues. I think it is part of letting go of that lie of separation to reach out in our vulnerabilities to teachers, guides, therapists, trusted friends, to heal the world and each other. Suzuki Roshi used to say that when you have a wild horse, give it a big pasture. That pasture, for me, is our Zazen. Sitting in Zazen, we can have the space to see the consequences of our desires and our actions, our conditioning around them, and their fundamental impermanence. Even if we were these isolated selves that we feel ourselves to be, there is no satisfaction that lasts through sense gratification or grasping at things like fame and fortune. They do not suddenly make us immune to life's impermanence. But if we really sit with them and allow ourselves to feel into them without shame or judgment, and finally to let go of them, they can be a gateway back to impermanence, back to Buddha nature, a place where they can also be transformed. Buddhist scholar David Loy says, instead of emphasizing the duality between good and evil, Buddhism distinguishes between wholesome and unwholesome tendencies, Negative motivations reinforce the sense of separation between myself and others. That is why we need to be transformed. That is why they need to be transformed into the more wholesome and non-dualistic counterparts. Greed into generosity, ill will into loving kindness, and delusion into wisdom. Really experiencing the destructiveness and futility of the three poisons and deeply exploring their origins can be a bridge to these wholesome attitudes that Lloyd describes and that are essential for liberation. We can use our practice to identify those thoughts and conditions that give rise to the three poisons and engage with them differently while nurturing the thoughts that give rise to the wholesome attitudes. And I have to say here that in my life, I've found that intention and action can help tremendously here. Whether it's volunteering at a soup kitchen, becoming an activist, a social or environmental activist, or just listening and responding more slowly to something that someone is saying to you. It's putting ourselves in the way of good trouble. Here's another experience from my life that may shed some light on this conversation. Back in the days when I used to commute home from work, I came home one day after a long day in a pretty bad mood. As I got out of the car, the strap of my briefcase caught on the stick shift and yanked me back, bumping my head on the doorframe. Anger boiled over me like I was possessed. I was shouting and swearing like a sailor, and since there was no one really to blame, I began punching the seat with all my might. If anybody had seen me doing this, I would have been mortified. But after a few seconds, the rage passed, and I was left mostly embarrassed. I was not able to catch this in the moment. But that night, as I lay in bed, some of the mental constructs and conditioning that made that fury possible came to me. I saw how I have tried to make myself safe in life through people-pleasing strategies. Being nice to people, which is usually better than the alternative. But there can still be an effort to control and manipulate others. Safety was acutely important to me because of a trauma that I had suffered in my early childhood. When this strategy didn't work for me, I sometimes got frustrated or irritated. I also saw how from an early age, I had made an unconscious bargain with life. The bargain was, if I was a good boy, then things should go my way. Unfortunately, emptiness doesn't really cut deals. You just get what you get. So after a string of disappointments, rage overcame me. Because reality wasn't conforming to my expectations. It's embarrassing to say this stuff, but it's also liberating. Because bringing these stories to the light helps to erode their power. Ultimately, I found that this part of myself that was angry just wanted control to attain safety and peace. And that I could give it those things to the best of my ability. If I stay attentive or present to my expectations and motivations in life, I can and have been able to be more in balance, in alignment. I won't say that I don't get angry or irritated anymore, but it is not so explosive, and I usually recover more quickly. And when I do, I more often see it as an invitation to practice, to go deeper. One day I was telling myself an old I am a victim themed story. And right in the moment, I just saw its emptiness. And I began to chuckle to myself. That's all it took to loosen its grip on me on that occasion. It is by being open-hearted and curious about our own conditioning and our own anger, greed, or delusion that we begin to heal them. In understanding my own anger, lust, delusion, I begin to understand it in other people, which for me has been the root of compassion. When that happens, when I step out of my delusion of separation, that is when attunement happens. That is when I can see our Buddha nature. I want to end with a poem that I like by my friend Larry Robinson, because I think it captures the human predicament and this kind of two sides of impermanence, of freedom and folly. The poem is called Falling. In these awe-filled days of fire and flood, we watch and wait and wonder when that fierce hand might reach at last for us. Those of us not yet touched by calamity quake, knowing in our bones that though we may be spared this time, time will level us all. No magic amulets, no prayers, good deeds, or good looks can promise protection from our terminal condition. And those who have watched a child swept forever from our arms, or fled the flames that swallowed our hopes and our memories, or hid from the bombs or the predator's gaze, know that nothing now will ever be the same, as if anything ever were. For all of us are falling like ashes, like rain, like petals or leaves, but we are falling together. And if we knew in truth that there was nowhere to land, tell me, could we know the difference between falling and flying? For all of us are falling like ashes, like rain, like petals or leaves, but we are falling together. And if we knew in truth that there was nowhere to land, tell me, could we know the difference between falling and flying? There is nowhere to land. Are we flying or falling? Perhaps that depends on whether we are working with what arises and our conditioning with the understanding that it and we are impermanent, empty, and that at any moment can be a moment of opening to our Buddha nature. Thank you. Now, I don't know if we have time, so I'm going to look to you, Corin, to tell me if we do. But if we do, I would like to take 10 minutes to invite you all to a breakout session.
And Barry, how many people in the rooms would you like?
Just two, I think. And
Just two.
yeah, the idea is for you to discuss a time in your life when one of the three poisons helps serve as a bridge or a gate to clarity, compassion, awakening, or Buddha nature. Or if that doesn't do it for you, just identify the poisons or mental constructs in yourself that you find the most challenging. And please remember to change speakers after 5 minutes so that everyone's heard. And of course, if neither of those calls to you, there's always Zazen.